Hello everyone, and welcome to Lecture 18 in our ongoing series on Middle Egyptian and hieroglyphics. This week, we will be covering the participle. The participle, not the particle, which is a totally different part of speech, is an adjectival form of the verb. Mostly, there's an asterisk there, which we'll get to in a minute. Most of Chapter 10, and indeed parts of Chapter 11, are devoted to the participle. This is because the participle is quite complicated. Complicated enough, in fact, that I attempted to record this several times last week and ended up having to go back and rewrite this for clarity because it is simply a confusing enough topic that it took just far more work for me to do than a regular episode. As such, I recommend you pay close attention, that you go back over parts you don't understand, that sort of thing. This is very important. It will come up a lot now that we've learned it, and at the same time, very complicated. So please do your best to follow along. And as always, if you have questions, put them in the comments and I will answer them. In summary, participles have 6 different forms. Asterisk. There's another one we'll get to later that falls a bit outside the mold. They come in 2 voices, active and passive, much like other forms of Egyptian verbs like the circumstantial. They also come in 3 sort of temporal forms. You have the perfect, the imperfect, and the prospective. The perfect is effectively a past tense, referring to completed action. The imperfect is a present tense, ongoing action. And the prospective is, much like the regular perspective, a wish or exhortation for the future. Not necessarily that something will happen as a prediction, but a hope that something is going to happen. It can modify a noun, like a regular adjective, be a predicate adjective, like a regular adjective, or it can just serve as a noun on its own, which is where a lot of the confusion grammatically comes from. It follows the adjective and noun marking scheme, so it has grammatical gender, male or female, it has number, singular, dual, or plural, but it can kind of take objects. That's another kind of confusing point we'll get to somewhat later in the video. And they have passive and active voice-like verbs. They have something like a tense system, like it's not true tense, but it's effectively tense, much like regular verbs. So we're going to have to go through what this means. First, we kind of need to go over the use cases so you can see what it actually means when you encounter a participle before we can go over how to recognize them. One of the ways that a participle can work is just as a regular noun. In general, although this translation doesn't hold up all the time, but in general, when you see a participle of some verb X, think the one who does X. Most of the time in English, these words end with ER or occasionally like OR or just an R. So think like teacher or learner or doer, anything like that. Any career word, quote unquote, would be a participle in Egyptian. Anything specifying someone who does an action, basically. It's going to be a participle, and it's going to show up like a noun. And this also applies to abstract notions. One of the examples Hoke gives is one who tells the truth. That would be a phrase beginning with a participle, jed ma'at. Jed there being a participle, meaning one who says, and then ma'at, the truth. Like I said, they can take objects. All forms of the participle can be nouns. And as you would expect, the tense refers to when the person did it. So, for example, you might say that someone was someone who told the truth, or is someone who tells the truth, or should be someone who tells the truth. All of those you can imagine a use case for, and all of them are perfectly grammatically valid in Egyptian, just with different forms of the participle. And those, by the way, were all in active voice. If you noticed, it's someone who's doing something. One who has the truth told to them. You could probably find a better way to do it, like a hearer of the truth, and still keep it active, but that would be a passive form. So all 6 of the forms that we're going to talk about can serve as nouns, and they all carry this basic meaning, just with different senses of whether you're the recipient of the action or the doer of the action, and whether it happens now, it happened in the past, or it should happen at some indefinite point in the future. Participles can also serve as adjectives in both types of roles that an adjective can take. That means that they can just sit behind a noun and modify the noun. So think, this is actually where we use participles in English the most, at least non-verbally when you're using them. A participle in English, you might remember from one of our very first videos, is the verb plus the ing ending. So you might talk about the running man, although more commonly you use the nominal form, or what in Egyptian would be the nominal form of the participle. In English, what we might call an occupational word, runner. And sometimes, or the other case is as a predicate adjective. He is running. In English, it is possible to parse this as a predicate adjective. It is also possible to parse this as being a sentence with a noun and an active verb in a present perfect, like an ongoing form. The perfect thing is different between English and Egyptian, so don't get that confused. The noun modifier form is pretty simple. It works like any other adjective. You have some noun, and you follow it with an adjective that agrees with it in gender and number. That gender-number agreement may come up if you're wondering whether you have a noun in bound construction or an adjective, because it might be hard to tell at the outset, because participles can be both adjectives and nouns, which one you're dealing with. And the answer is, if it's masculine singular, you're just going to have to take whatever makes the most sense meaning-wise. But if you're looking at like one of them is feminine and one of them is masculine, if they aren't agreeing effectively in gender and number, then you're probably dealing with about 2 nouns in bound construction. If they do agree, you're probably dealing with an adjective modifying participle, which again, in that case, you just translate with the verb plus ing in English, and that will, if it's not the most correct translation, will at least point you almost certainly in the direction of that most correct, least awkward sounding translation. Predicate adjective, we're going to comment on a little bit more. This is because it's pretty broad. It's broader than you would expect. He is happy. Yeah, okay. The verb for rejoicing would make a lot of sense to put there. But you could also say that he is hiding and he is the one who does whatever thing. Those are all perfectly allowable to use as predicate adjectives. And what's particularly interesting about this is that the predicate adjective begins the sentence, because that's how predicate adjectives work, as you may remember. We learned that quite a while ago. Then followed by the noun. So you have a verb followed by a noun about something that someone is doing, especially if it's an imperfect, if it's in the present tense, something that someone is currently doing. That sounds a lot like the present circumstantial, because it is. It would sound different in spoken Egyptian, but written down without the vowels, it conveys both basically the same meaning and basically the same grammar. So there's no real reason to worry about it. Either way, you're going to end up with a functionally identical translation. Realistically, you could just, if you were asked on a quiz about it, you could say that it looks like both, and it could easily be both. It would be dependent on hearing the speaker use different vowels, because the forms were differentiated by different vowels in spoken Egyptian. As we'll see, there are a few verbs where you will be able to see a difference, but maybe you won't. Maybe it will look the same, and the context won't give you any clues, and then it doesn't matter, because both will produce an adequate translation. Also, one other little note, well, 2 other notes. First of all, it doesn't use suffix pronouns. It uses dependent pronouns if the subject is a noun, or if the subject is a pronoun. Also, it can take that wy, how, x ending as an exclamatory, like other predicate adjectives. Uh, just things to note, neither should be terribly surprising. All right, now that we know what the particle or the participle means, we can talk about how to recognize it and what the different forms both look like and how they behave, the connotations of their different meanings. The first one we're going to look at is the imperfect, the present tense. Those of you who are here because you're interested in Afro-Asiatic grammar are probably already annoyed that I'm telling you about the imperfect before the perfect. It's pretty traditional in Hebrew grammar to talk about the perfect form of the regular verb, the past tense, first, but this is how Hoke does it, so this is how we are going to do it. Imperfect, the present tense, is recognizable by seeing, in the third week verbs, because they fully geminate. So they lose their weak vowel and take on a second strong vowel. Ha'i becomes ha'a, for example. The second geminate verbs also do geminate, so they look like their written forms effectively. Redi, interestingly, becomes dead, because it loses the R, like it does in a lot of forms, and then it loses the I and geminates because it's the third week, so now it's dead. Iri becomes irer or ir, which looks like a lot of other forms, frankly. The passive especially, but frankly also the active, so it's not a great guide, tends to take a W ending. This is something that's true of a lot of forms of the participle. For the passives, it's mostly the masculine singular, but realistically, it's not a great indicator of what you're dealing with because most forms can take it, especially the masculine singular passive and then the masculine singular active, and basically participles regularly end in W, but because it's a vowel, the Egyptians were never consistent about writing it, so it just helps in guessing. That being said, let's take a look at a couple of examples. Here is an imperfect active as an adjective. Ak sejm en sa sejmu. So the translation Hope gives, listening is good for a son who listens or for an obedient son. So let's break down the grammar here. So ach is our predicate adjective. It's an adjective, means good, not as common as nefer, what we've been learning, but it means good. And it is followed, of course, by the noun. In this case, the noun's actually a verb. It is an infinitive, sejm, because we have a verb sitting in this nominal position. And in a situation where it doesn't make a lot of sense to translate in context, as we'll see with later words, to translate as the ER form, we can take it as the act itself, as the infinitive. So if you're confused which one to take, it's honestly not a bad strategy to try it with both the infinitive type meaning and the participle type meaning, and see which one yields a better translation. Taking sejm as an infinitive type translation, we get listening is good, and with a participle type translation, we get a listener is good. Both are valid sentences, but considering the next two words are for a son or for the son, it'd be kind of weird to expect a listener is good for a son, but listening is good for a son. That makes a lot of sense. That's the kind of thing parents have said to their kids for clearly thousands of years. So we can safely guess that sejm is an infinitive, and then move on to the rest of the translation. Listening is good for a son, and now we have another verb in a weird position, following a noun, meaning either a bound construction verb, or bound construction noun, or an adjective. It's got a W at the end, interestingly, sejmu. And of course, finding a W at the end of a verb means that you're very, very likely dealing with a participle. So that means we're either dealing with a word meaning something like listener or something like listening. And here, this is a case where English kind of steers us the wrong way, I think, a little bit in understanding what's going on. First of all, if we were to take this as the nominal form, then it would become the son of a listener. That doesn't make much sense. We don't usually talk about somebody as being the child of a listener. That's not really a profession. That's a word you could use, sure, but why would the parentage be important in the context here? We can guess pretty safely that this is an adjective. This is a listening son. Listening in this case is kind of weird to hear. It's not a super common English use. So Hoke supplies two possible translations. Listening is good for a son who listens. Perfectly fine translation. In fact, you'll see that this who does X thing, these kind of relative sentences or relative clauses are not super uncommon when dealing with participles. But his other one I actually like a little more, an obedient son, because you're still using an adjective, and when your kid listens, you say that they're obedient. That's what's going on here. So listening is good for an obedient son. Kind of a weird tautological sentence. I think the real takeaway is if a son who listens is served well by doing so. But that's not the way the Egyptians like to write things. Also, you'll notice I just spent several minutes going over a 5-word sentence because there are so many possible alternative interpretations of each of the uses of the participle and the infinitive. The introduction to the participle really does throw a wrench in translating things and makes it take longer because there are so many possible concepts it could be expressing and possible ways to interpret it. I'm not going to go over every one of our sentences in this much detail, but let this be a bit of a lesson about how complicated this form can be. It really is difficult, and you really do need to be careful and pay good attention to make sure that you really understand what all the words are trying to tell you. Because there is going to be a reasonable translation in there somewhere. You just might have to dig a little to find it. Here, we're going to find a nominal version of our imperfect. You, chesef, which is that rather unique character with the snake. Tu en sua cher hepu. You, of course, just starts our sentence, which is a pretty standard circumstantial sentence, so we're starting with you. Chesef is a verb meaning to punish, and interestingly, it takes its object in the dative as opposed to in an indirect object, as opposed to as a direct object like we would expect. Tu is our subject, just a very generic one, so one punishes, and then the interesting part is our indirect object, our dative, en sua cher hepu. And just introduces the fact that it's the dative, so we can kind of ignore that. It's making it the subject of the verb. Cher hepu is a prepositional phrase. It's modifying a noun, and our noun is sua. Although, as you can probably guess from the hieroglyph, sua is a verb. It's got the little walking legs. It's about going somewhere. What it means is to pass over. So we know this one has to be a noun. It is in a place where we're expecting the object of a verb, which means that we need a noun. It follows a preposition immediately, which means there needs to be a noun there to act as the object of that preposition. It's being modified by a preposition, so we can be fairly certain that this is a noun. So what would that mean for a noun to be, or for the verb to pass over to be a noun? It means someone who passes over. There's no real ER word here. English wouldn't permit the equivalent of the participle, so to speak, but Egyptian does. One punishes he who passes over, And here we have another relative clause because it's not exactly easy to translate that into a clean English sentence. So one who passes over, or he who passes over. Kapu, the laws. One punishes him who passes over the laws. We also have a good example of the imperfect passive. This is kind of an incomplete sentence. It's just a little phrase. It's 4 words. Ireret, although written here as iret, nebet, en nesu. And Hope gives it as all of the things that are done for a king. The first thing you might have noticed is the n is a negative arms. Yeah, that's true. It is. That is a typo made by an ancient scribe, which Hoke left in, and I have left in. It does not mean no. It's just the regular preposition en. In this case, en nesu, for a king. That's the easy part to translate. Once you realize that someone thousands of years ago made a minor and eventually kind of conventionalized spelling error. The other things are more interesting. Ireret, of course, the verb ir means to do. And then irer, or as a participle as a nominal participle would be that which is done. Nebet, of course, means all. And so we can just take as a simple translation, all that is done for a king. You will note, interestingly, that ireret is a feminine. Participles are gendered and numbered, and it is perfectly allowable to have a feminine version of a participle, ireret, and that's also been pluralized, all of the things that are done for a king. Or if you were to take this really literally, and I do not recommend translating like this, but if you were to take it literally in the Egyptian grammar, all of the doings for the king. No English speaker would ever say that in a natural English sentence, but that's what the grammar is doing. It has created this word doings out of the verb do, because in Egyptian you can just do that with any verb, and then planted it in what would in a relatively normal sentence, all of the doings for the king. All right, that's all on the imperfect. Let's talk a little bit about the perfect participle. This represents something that has been completed, something that is in past time. It does kind of the opposite with its geminates as the previous form. The third weak and second geminate, instead of getting an extra letter, fully geminating, they lose it. Kebeb becomes keb. Ha'i or ha'a in the imperfect participle becomes ha. Radi can be radi or d. Irer can be irer or ir. Those just do weird stuff in participles, unfortunately. The passive is basically the same. Sometimes it will take on a y ending, interestingly. Although, to be fair, that also will occasionally happen in the imperfect. And okay, you'll sometimes find a W. You'll sometimes find a W in the active as well, in the third masculine singular especially. Again, they sometimes end with vowels. They often don't. You're lucky if you find one, and you may well not. So let's go over some examples and actually get to translating these things, which, as you've probably seen, is basically the only way to really piece together what they're actually saying. So this is an example of our perfect active. Ha necher, the flesh of the god or the king's body. Abech em irsu. This is based on Hoke's translation and also the context that he gives in kind of a series of phrases describing what has happened. The flesh of the god having been united with the one who made him, i.e., the king's died and gone on to the afterlife. That the meaning is relatively simple, but we do need to break down what is going on. So our statement begins with a noun and is part of a list of circumstances. So the thing that follows it, we would expect to be an adjective. And that is indeed what we get. We find a verb, but a verb that can take on an adjectival meaning. Abech means to unite, to bring together. And in this case, if we take it as a participle, because we need an adjectival form because it's following a noun, we find a meaning that makes a lot of sense. Having has been united. Well, this is just a long noun phrase. It ultimately ends up working pretty well to describe a set of circumstances. And we know this is the perfect because it would be very weird to say that the king is currently dying in a letter, context of this, but it makes quite a bit of sense to say that the king has died. As you can tell, the difference between the perfect and the imperfect is context, and it's usually quite clear from the context and what verb is being used and that kind of thing, whether it should be something that's considered to be ongoing or something that's ended. If this were to be an imperfect, if this were something, that someone was saying, like, rushedly, the king is dying, the king's flesh is being united with the one who made him, which would be a weirdly poetic way to announce the death of the king in, panic tones at the first moment, grammatically, it wouldn't appear any different to us. That would also be ha neter achvu emirsu. But from the context of the story, we know that it must have happened in the past. The king's flesh has been united with the one who made him. Therefore, unite must be a participle describing the king's flesh in the perfect active. Here we have another example, one for the perfect passive. Ui mi es itu em achachu. Not an easy word to pronounce there at the end. Me, remember, is a preposition meaning like. So the first part of the sentence is just I was like or I am like. It's not immediately obvious until we get the context, and to uncover what he is like or was like to get a better understanding of what's being talked about here. Sa, a man. Itu em achachu. Achachu is darkness. Em is in or by. And itu is a verb meaning to overpower. Now, it wouldn't make much sense to take it that itu as a noun. It would put it in bound construction with a man, and a man of overpowering doesn't make a ton of sense. However, a man who overpowers or who is overpowered, that could be a lot more meaningful, so we'll take it as an adjectival form. Now the real question is active or passive. Grammatically, there's very little difference, but let's look at the meaning of each. The speaker, this is another excerpt from the story of Sinui, so same guy as in the previous one. He's either like a man who has overpowered by darkness, or overpowered in darkness. So he's either like fought somebody in the dark and won, which would be weird, or he's used darkness to overpower, which is, something to be appropriate in some kind of weird superhero movie villain origin story, but not exactly the kind of thing the Egyptians regularly wrote about. Or he was overpowered by darkness. taking in the passive with the, rather than he overpowers, but he was overpowered. That's something that could make a lot of sense. He's depressed, down in the dumps, something that happens to a lot of people all the time. Sure, it's a poetic way of putting it. This is the story of Sinewy, and that's a pretty expressive story. So it would make a lot more sense to take this as him saying, I was in a bad place. I was overpowered by darkness, rather than him saying, I overpowered with or in darkness. So we can take that as our final translation. I was like a man who had been overpowered by darkness. And again, another relative sentence just to make it make sense, rather than I was like a man being overpowered by darkness, or I was like a man having been overpowered by darkness, in order to take that past sense. And again, no real grammatical indication of the past. We're in a narrative past kind of situation where Sinewy is describing events that had previously happened to him, and therefore we know it's in the past. So only the context could really tell us that. You could imagine this being perfectly fine in the imperfect in a different context where someone is talking about how bad it is for them right now. Finally, we deal with the prospective participle, which, yes, is actually quite related meaning-wise. I don't know enough about linguistics to tell you whether it is grammatically related, but it is semantically related to the regular prospective. It looks identical to the perfect particle in active, and the passive looks exactly the same as the active. So in other words, this looks precisely like the perfect. There is no way to tell them apart. You're just going to have to give it your best guess, which is even more true with this form than the other forms. It means occasionally it can convey like some future time, but most commonly you're dealing with like a should or an ought or something like that, as in the regular perspective. So that's almost always going to be the translation you can go with. As we'll see, there is another way that always does convey the future. This one can, but very rarely does. The prospective, here we have an example of the prospective active. This one is from The Eloquent Peasant. It's a good story for these because it talks about the thing that should be happening, but the contrasted with what is happening. So in this case, chesef iu cher iret iut. The translation given is the one who should punish crime is committing offenses. Chesef iu, first cher iret is an example of something we haven't seen in a while, actually. The ongoing infinitive plus her. So her irit iut is an ongoing is committing offenses. And then we have the first part of the sentence, chesef iu. So chesef is a verb. As we've seen, it means to punish. And iu is, in this case, a noun meaning crime. Now, this could mean one of two things. Well, actually, with the hair, it actually kind of does solve that problem. Because what we're probably encountering, considering as we have a hair followed by an infinitive, is an ongoing action kind of sentence, which, as you remember, ends up looking a bit like an English sentence where you have a noun and then your hair plus infinitive ongoing verb, and then any other adverbial modifiers following after that. So the first thing we're expecting is a noun, and we have a verb. Wouldn't make any sense if we had a verb there. We couldn't have crime punishes is committing offenses. That would be total nonsense in Egyptian and in English. So instead, we have to assume that we're dealing with a nominal form. So either punishing, the infinitive form, like the active doing it, or someone who punishes. And again, saying punishing is committing offenses, it's kind of an oxymoron, unlikely to be found in Egyptian texts. Punishing people as illegal is a weird sentiment. And it wouldn't explain what you is doing. So instead, what we're dealing with here is clearly a participle, someone who should punish, with an object, something that you'll remember they're allowed to do. Chesef iu, one who punishes crime. And now we need to determine which form it is. So it could be one who punished crime is committing offenses, one who punishes crime is committing offenses, or one who should punish crime is committing offenses. All three would be theoretically possible, but the one that makes the most sense is that one who should punish crime is committing offenses. Because what's clearly being set up here, and one that's especially evident from the context of the speech, is injustice is being done. And the most unjust thing that could happen is for the justice system itself to be corrupt. At least, in this context, in the context of a legal dispute, the worst case scenario is that the judge is actually a criminal, right? That would be a logical meaning for this, and that's the translation Hope gives, and I think the one that is almost certainly meant by the text, as a perspective. The person who should be punishing crime is actually doing crime. The one who should punish crimes is committing offenses. We also have a good example of the prospective passive. Em, amu, ibek, her, jedti, en ek. Here, em is sort of a negative exhortation. Do not amu ibek, do not be neglectful in your heart. Idiom, but yeah, just do not neglect. Here we get something interesting. A rare but occasional thing that happens in the prospective passive participle to watch for. The feminine taking a T ending. So that is a perfectly allowed thing. This is not a stative. This is a perspective. That's just something that can happen. Her, jedti, enek. Of course, her is a preposition. The thing following a preposition is going to be a noun. So, jedti, enek. That which might be said to you. And because this is a passive, it's not, and we know it's the passive because of the TI, but it's not someone who says, but rather something that is said to you. It's not that you're not taking the active role of speaking, you're taking the passive role. Something is being said and you are listening. And again, the TI marks it as perspective, but the fact that this is a request, a do not be neglectful, rather than a statement of something that's currently ongoing, even if that TI weren't there, we could safely conclude that this is a perspective because you're asking someone to do something, i.e. there's something they should do, which means you're probably going to guess verbs you encounter in a nominal way are almost certainly going to be either a perspective or a perspective particle or participle. Few more notes on passive participles. Passives especially, although as we've seen, it's entirely possible for this to happen and be logically fine with actives, are followed by a form of the direct object. With passives in particular, they're called complementary direct objects, and they act as the subject in English translations. So, with Jed, if Jed took a complementary direct object of some noun, the king, whatever, then that would become the subject. It would be the king was saying or would say. It could also be a dependent pronoun, not a suffix, but a dependent pronoun. The suffix pronoun following a noun would of course make it possessive and would open up a whole other host of meanings. Or even a demonstrative, like this, that, these, and those. There's also something that Egyptian uses that English absolutely does not require, called a resumptive, that would sometimes follow passives. Like where or there, or even like on it, or you're dealing with like a prepositional phrase or an adverb of some sort, and you will see these and you will think to yourself, what's that doing there? This doesn't really mean anything, but vaguely relates back to the main concept, but ultimately adds nothing. And you're right, it doesn't add anything. It's a grammatical thing that Egyptian sometimes requires, but that has no meaning in English, and you can skip it. So if you see a hanging prepositional phrase and you've confirmed that you've made no errors in your translation, because that's also a reason that you might find a weird prepositional phrase somewhere is you've gotten it wrong, you can just kind of skip. So we have a good example of an active, or of a passive participle with an object. Bu iru heru im, the place where the sound was made. So this one, Hoke actually does a good job of breaking down. Bu, which means place, is being modified by a passive participle, iru, a perfect, to be specific, although because it's ear, it would be hard to tell without knowing more context. Which is, of course, ear is to do, so it's, as an adjective, it was which was done. And then heru is our object, sound. So we take that again as the subject. So then it becomes the sound was done. And of course, so it's the place the sound was done. Well, there's a word missing in English, and that word would be where. The place where the sound was done. Done's an awkward word. You should probably just take made, because ear can be either. The last word, im, is a resumptive. You'll notice that in English, we wouldn't say the place where the sound was made there. That last word is unnecessary. But Egyptian likes them, so you'll find them a lot. But you can just skip it. You can ignore it and move on to the rest of the translation. You can also have a pretty common form of or pretty common use of the passive. The passive in a bound construction. So like the title "Beloved of the God" comes up a decent amount in tombs. God usually meaning king here. Meru necher. Meru comes the verb mer, or mera really, meaning to love. Make it a participle with that W ending, and now it's the noun, meaning beloved. But nouns can take bound constructions. Beloved of the God. Just perfectly common and reasonable, and does not really behave any differently from any other noun. You can also have a passive participle being possessed by the genitival n. It's also perfectly fine. There is one other form of the participle worth noting. The segem tfi future active participle. There are 6.5 forms of the participle. This is not a full form. It is only allowed in the third person, so third singular and plural. There are forms for the masculine and feminine singular, as well as a gender-neutral plural. The fully written out ending is t-fi in the masculine, t-c in the feminine, and t-sen in the plural. But the y's are not always written. They regularly get skipped. Sometimes they'll write one y, but not the other, and sometimes they'll write none of them. But it is not the tef form. It is still t-fi. They just got lazy and did not write the vowels as they're wont to do. The third week and second geminate verbs are, the third week do not geminate. I miswrote that. It should be no gemination. And the second geminate do. Rather unusually, they don't behave the same way. Of particular note, EE, U, RD, and WHEN are unchanged. They are not used as predicate adjectives, and they serve as a true future form. This is a genuine he will do rather than a he should do. Sometimes the perspective can serve this role, but this one only serves as a will happen. You're saying that something is the most likely outcome, not that you want it to happen necessarily, you just think it's going to happen. Also, in theory, the masculine singular could look a lot like a sejm 2f when both of the y's are gone. However, that will almost never come up. The sejm 2f passive and the sejm tf future active participle will basically never show up in the same place. They have totally different grammatical functions, and you will always be able to differentiate them. So do not worry about that. And then we do have actually a good example for our future active participle. I only took part of it because both of the examples that were given were very long. It would just be like substantially too much. Also, I apologize, I forgot the introductory particle to this part. Ich, the word that's missing, not the German word for I, but rather a particle of consequence. So then, jed seru sejm t sen, neferwi peru nrf. Translation is, then the officials who hear will say, how fine are the declarations of his mouth, which is just the sort of wonderfully awkward translations that you get sometimes getting from Egyptian. Jed Seru, perfectly natural, is just the officials will say, but then we have an adjective modifying it, sejm t sen. And because it's t sen, you know perfectly well that it's a participle and that it's a future active. No real need to worry yourself with figuring out alternative possibilities. And it becomes who will hear. So then the officials who will hear will say, neferwi, how fine, peru, are the things that come out. Per is a verb for come out. You've got a verb followed by a W, a participle. We have another participle that Hoke has snuck in. Really, the ancient author wrote in, and he just picked a really good example. And in this case, a noun, because we're following it with an N and another noun, either a preposition or a genitival, depending on the context, but in either case, a thing you'd expect for a noun. How fine are the declarations NRF of his mouth? All right, that's everything Chapter 10 has to say on the participles. There's going to be more in Chapter 11, if memory serves, but that is for another day. We're going to tie up some loose ends in Chapter 9 and 10 on the next episode, hopefully sometime reasonably soon. I apologize that these have taken a while to get out. This one was because of the complexity of the subject matter. It took me longer to make than usual by a decent margin, even when I did finally get time to work on it. Please, if you have any questions, I know this is confusing. I tried my best to go over things at length, but there's only so much I can do. If you found any of this confusing, please leave me questions. I enjoy answering them. I'm fairly certain the YouTube algorithm enjoys it as well. So, yes, please ask me any questions that you have. Thank you for listening.